The small house looks quaint, and the front steps are flanked by two swan statues at 966 Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Passing by, you wouldn't give it a second look. Inside this house, however, unimaginable things are happening. What started small in 1971 escalated to such a degree by 1974 that local police, firefighters, friends, and family didn't know how to help the Goodin family. And how could they? Who would ever think that they'd walk into a scene where the kitchen table flips over on its own, knives fly across the room, televisions tip over, and unexplainable banging sounds keep you awake at night? This isn't a script from a horror movie. It's what the Goodins, law enforcement, and firefighters all experienced inside this house over the course of several terrifying days. So what exactly was it? A poltergeist? A demonic presence? Or was it a hoax, all coordinated by a 10-year-old girl? In this episode, we'll take a close look at one of the most well-documented paranormal cases in American history. Get ready to question everything you thought was possible. Welcome to the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth, and this is the true story of the Lindley Street haunting. If you enjoy well-thought-out episodes of true crime and the paranormal, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button. Your support helps us bring you more true crime and paranormal episodes that will always keep you on the edge of your seats. So let's start at the beginning. The Goodins, Jerry and Laura, didn't get married until later in life. They married in 1960 when Jerry was 41 and Laura was 36. Shortly after they got married, they purchased a home on Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The home was all of 738 square feet with a bedroom and a bathroom. To put it in perspective, this was only slightly larger than a standard two-car garage in today's standards. In 1961, on Halloween, Laura, who was now 37, gave birth to a baby boy. They named him Jerry Jr. Now, at first, he appeared as healthy as any other child, but little did they know that their challenges as parents were just beginning. When Jerry Jr. was 6 months old, a neighbor noticed something about him that she pointed out. She noticed that Jerry Jr.'s head always seemed to hang down. Now, this, of course, concerned the Goodins, so they took him to the doctor. The diagnosis was that Jerry Jr. had cerebral palsy. It didn't matter to the Goodins. They loved their little boy so much, and even with the little amount of money that they had, they did everything they could for him. They purchased special equipment that included a special chair and leg braces, and Jerry Jr. became their entire world. They gave him constant attention and wouldn't even think about hiring a babysitter for him. Jerry Jr. went everywhere with his mom and dad. In 1967, when Jerry Jr. was 6 years old, almost 7, he got a cold, which got worse and worse. It got so complicated that he had to be admitted to the hospital and ended up passing away just 3 days prior to his 7th birthday. At Jerry Jr.'s burial service, Father Grimes, one of the pastors from the Goodins Church, asked the Goodins if they'd consider adoption. Now, to me, this seemed awfully soon to approach a family who was reeling with the loss of their only child. It almost felt hurried. Why not give the couple a chance to grieve first? To make matters even more complicated, Laura had discovered that she had a tumor and was scheduled to have a hysterectomy the day after Jerry Jr.'s burial service. She would be unable to have any more children. Now, Laura had to face not only the loss of her only child, but also the ability to have any more children at all. How does someone cope with all of that? The Goodins as you might imagine, were consumed by their grief. So what they did is they created a shrine for Jerry Jr. in their living room. There was a picture of him in his casket with a statue of Jesus next to him, and a light focused on both of these. Every day, they would visit his grave. Now, at first, Laura couldn't go because of her surgery, but Jerry did, and as soon as Laura was able to, she joined him. I can't even imagine the loss that they felt. It was May of 1968, and the shrine in their home of Jerry Jr. had stood there for 6 months. It was actually Laura who decided it was time to move on. Maybe she felt she couldn't bear the constant pain any longer by looking at Jerry Jr.'s picture every day. Or maybe she felt that it was just time. What we do know is that in May of 1968, the Goodins went to Father Grimes and asked him about the adoption that he had mentioned before. They learned that there was a 4.5-year-old Native American girl in Canada who needed a home. Laura, too, was of Native American descent and felt that this might be a good fit for their family. So in June of 1968, the Goodins packed up and traveled to Ontario, where they were to meet this little girl named Marcia. They fell in love with her as soon as they laid eyes on her, and the adoption agency felt that it would be an excellent fit. The Goodins then brought back Marcia to Bridgeport with them. Laura and Jerry were to be parents once again. They didn't have a lot of room in the house and certainly didn't have an extra bedroom for Marcia. So what Jerry did is he converted a large closet into a bedroom just for her. As 1968 started to wrap up the year, there were some strange things that started to happen inside the Goodin home. Nothing that would make you worried or concerned. These things were small items disappearing, like car keys or a hairbrush, and Laura and Jerry just chalked it up to being absent-minded. I mean, they did have a new member of the family that took a lot of their time, so they felt that they just weren't paying close attention. But then it began to happen all the time. The Goodins knew that they couldn't be this absent-minded, and they began to question what was going on. Now, the only experience that the Goodins had when it came to taking care of a child was their son, Jerry Jr., and so this was their introduction into parenthood. When Marcia came into their lives, they began to treat Marcia the same way they had treated Jerry Jr. Laura saw to it that nothing would harm Marcia, so much so that she isolated Marcia and all but kept her leashed to the home. She didn't allow Marcia to go to friends' houses, even if they lived across the street, because Laura had this fear that Marcia was going to get hit by a car. Laura walked Marcia to and from school every single day. She would even show up during recess and walk with Marcia around the school rather than risk her getting hurt by playing outside. Marcia, of course, she didn't know any better. She was so young when she was adopted that, this must have just been what she thought all families were like. But she had to notice, especially as she got older, that no other moms were walking their kids to and from school or showed up at recess. So even though Laura probably felt that she was doing the right thing for Marcia, what she was actually doing is not allowing Marcia to grow into her own person and learn how to socialize. Laura was confronted with this later on, and she would say that she grew up without any friends and she turned out just fine, so she didn't see the problem with what she was doing. When Marcia was at home, she would play board games by herself or draw pictures. In 1969, there was a little bit of hope, though. The Goodins had some friends, the Hoffmans, who would come over often to play cards, and they had a daughter right around the same age as Marcia. Her name was Rosemary. Now, when the Hoffmans first brought Rosemary over one evening, of course, things were a little tense. They had not met each other. Marcia had not met Rosemary and so forth. And so Rosemary went and sat on the living room couch on the opposite side of where Marcia was sitting. As the girls sat on the couch began to vibrate. The girls looked at each other, and Rosemary asked, "What is that?" Marcia didn't know. All of a sudden, Rosemarie's side lifted up in the air and then slammed back down. It was so loud that everyone came running into the room. Now, the Hoffmans, they became more regular visitors, and so did Rosemarie, who was now much more comfortable with Marcia and vice versa. She would now just head into Marcia's bedroom when she got there. Marcia would often be found sitting on the floor in her bedroom with her eyes closed and speaking a language that Rosemarie didn't understand. Rosemarie asked Marcia what she was doing, and Marcia said that she was talking to her grandfather, that she did it a lot. He was a chief on the reservation where she came from and was upset that Marcia had been taken away. Whenever Marcia wanted to talk to him, this is how she would do it. In November of 1971, Marcia is 7 years old, going on 8. She's been with the Goodins now for about 3 years. This November in particular, something strange started happening. The Goodins began to hear pounding outside of their house at night. Jerry described it as the, quote, house being stoned, and called the police. After the police showed up and a search for the noises, nothing was found, and the noises stopped after some time. The following year, in November, same month, November of 1972, the pounding was back. They again called the Bridgeport police. Now, their thought was that it was a neighbor playing a prank because the noises had actually started around Halloween. Or there was a group also that wanted to build a condo development next to the Goodins' home, and they thought that maybe they were doing something in order to force the Goodins out of their house. They couldn't understand what was going on. It wasn't something that they were scared of. It was just this big inconvenience because it generally happened at night and they couldn't sleep. The reason that they thought it was a person was because the sounds had a definite pattern to them. It would start as light tapping in the early evening, but as it got later and later, it would turn into extremely loud banging. One of their friends and neighbors, John Holdsworth, who was also a Bridgeport police officer, had suggested that he come over and record the sounds. Now, the purpose of this was that they wanted to investigate the sounds, and this would help give the city some kind of idea as to what they were hearing and what was going on. As John and Jerry went from room to room recording these knocking sounds, the sounds would follow them wherever they went. The neighbor that Jerry had initially thought might be the problem, because it was Halloween and he thought he might be playing a prank, ended up moving away, but the knocking still continued. Over the next few days, Jerry and Laura had nearly every department in the city coming in to look at their house. They looked at the pipes, they looked at the gas lines, the foundation, and anything else they could think of. Nothing could be found that would be the source of the poundings inside the home. The thing is, though, unlike last year, where the sounds just stopped, this year the sounds came back. They'd stop for a couple of weeks and then return. Again, the Goodins would have the house checked, and nothing was ever found to be the cause. In 1974, the Goodins, they didn't have much. But just like with Jerry Jr., they wanted the best for Marcia. So she actually attended a private school. This year, though, Jerry's work hours were cut back, and this meant less money for the family. So they made the very difficult decision to move Marcia to the public school system. While Marcia was there, she was bullied relentlessly. One boy actually ended up attacking Marcia so badly that she had to be put into a back brace. The Goodins, as you might imagine, were devastated. Laura was beside herself that she couldn't have protected her daughter. Because of this, the Goodins decided to have Marcia homeschooled. This now meant that Marcia had virtually no exposure to the outside world. When she did, it was always with her parents. To be sure that she stayed on track with school, though, they did hire a 21-year-old tutor by the name of Barbara Carter. That summer, even stranger things started to happen inside the Goodin household. Jerry and Laura had been watching television when they saw a hand appear in a window outside of their home. Jerry rushed outside to check who it might be and didn't find anyone. Later that summer, just before the school year was to begin, someone knocked 3 times on their front door. When they answered it, no one was there, but they did see wet footprints on the cement where somebody would have been standing, but wasn't. It hadn't been raining, and there was no way that this could have happened. In November, the dreaded November, the sounds of knocking in the house again started up. This time, though, things took a turn. Not just a, hey, the sounds are getting louder turn, but more of a, what the hell is happening in our house turn. Thursday, November 21st, 1974. The Goodins had the Holdsworths over for dinner. Now, John Holdsworth was the neighbor who was also an officer with the police department and the one who had helped Jerry record the knockings in November of 1971. When they arrived, they brought their 14-year-old daughter, Janet, with them. They're all sitting around the table, having a nice dinner, when all of a sudden there is a large crash from one of the back rooms. Startled by the sound, again, Jerry and John go to investigate. What they found was that the inside pane of a dual-paned window had completely shattered. No one had been in the room at the time, and there was no way that it could have happened on its own. The following day, on Friday, the Goodins were getting ready to head out on a road trip. They were going to do this on Saturday to visit family members. It would be nice for them to get out of the house, and they usually headed to Jerry's brother's house. And along the way, what they did is they attended church, they had their family visit, and then they went to a grocery store to wrap up the day. As they're getting all packed, they hear a strange sound. Now, no one could pinpoint what the sound was, so they went from room to try and find out. A window shade had rolled up as if someone had pulled on it. Then they heard other sounds from a different room. Curtains had fallen along with the entire curtain rod. No windows were open, there wasn't any breeze of any sort, so they couldn't figure out how they fell. Jerry put the curtains back up and began to walk out of the room when it happened again. No more than 30 minutes had gone by before they heard another sound. This time, the curtains fell off the kitchen door. Jerry went and put them back where they belonged. Later that night, as the family is sitting in the living room watching television, the knocking began again. This time, though, it was different. It started the same, slow and with a pattern, but then it became so loud that you needed to cover your ears. This was by far the worst it had ever been. Then, just like before, it just stopped. They'd been through this before. They knew things in the house had been checked and rechecked. They didn't know what it was or even how to fix it. But because they felt that it had stopped for the night, they all just decided to turn in. They had a trip the next day, after all. The Goodins left to go to Jerry's brother's house, and as usual, they went to church, then for a visit with Jerry's brother, and then a stop at the grocery store before then heading home. They walked in the door around 4:30 that Saturday afternoon. Marcia went to her room and then hollered for her parents. When Jerry walked in, he saw the strangest thing. Marcia's television was laying on top of her bed. This had never happened before. He had no idea how it happened at all. But he just picked it up, put it back where it belonged, and then went back to help Laura with the groceries. As Jerry entered the kitchen, he couldn't believe what he saw. The dishes that were in the sink began to levitate one by one and fly around the room. All he could do was watch. Every dish that had been picked up by some unseen force was then smashed to the floor. Now, their kitchen was covered in a Berber-type carpet, so it's not like they just fell from the air and broke. They would have had to have been purposefully and forcefully thrown at the floor to break like they did. As Jerry leaned down to pick up the pieces on the carpet, he heard another noise. The knife block on the kitchen counter began to rattle. and soon the knives flew from the block and headed right towards him. He ducked just in time. Now, instead of rushing out of the house in fear for his life, which, is crazy to me, he instead just told his wife, Laura, what had happened as she's bringing in the rest of the groceries. They stood in silence for what seemed like an eternity, just waiting for something else to happen. When nothing else did, Laura sat the groceries on the kitchen table and then began to take them out of the bags. As she reached into one of the bags to remove an item, the entire kitchen table began to rise and then entirely flipped over, taking all the groceries with it. Jerry picked up the table and put it back in place, and then picked up the groceries that had flown off the table so that they could be put away. This would be one of many, many, many times that the kitchen table would flip over on its own. The events of that day and over the next few days were just beginning. Their refrigerator, which weighed at least 300 pounds, began to levitate. It then turned a little and set itself back down. In the kitchen, there was also a large console television set. This sat on the floor between the stove and the countertop, and it was one of those televisions that was completely encased by wood. It sat on 4 legs, had those circular knobs on the front of them where you could change the channels. This thing also weighed around 100 to 150 pounds. As Laura stood there staring at the refrigerator, this television fell over and landed directly on top of 2 of Laura's toes. As she screamed in pain, Jerry lifted the television and put it back in place. Marcia and Jerry then helped Laura to a chair and grabbed some medical supplies to help render some kind of first aid to her foot. Once that was done, Jerry put the rest of the groceries away, or whatever was left of them, and made dinner. Nothing further happened during dinner. When dinner was done, they settled in the living room to watch television before going to bed. No one talked about what had happened, and this seems really strange to me. Wouldn't you just want to run out of your house and go somewhere, anywhere? The Goodins, though, seemed defiant. When they finally headed to bed and felt that things were okay for now, they heard Marcia scream from her room. Her television had again fallen from its shelf and landed on her ankle. No one felt comfortable enough being alone in their own rooms, so they all decided to head back to the living room and turn on a movie. At some point during the movie, Marcia had to use the bathroom. No sooner had she walked inside the room did the shower curtain fall. Jerry and Laura heard the racket and headed to the bathroom, where they saw towels lifting by themselves and being tossed into the tub. Toothpaste, deodorant, medication, toothbrushes, bottles of soap, everything that was on the bathroom shelf began to fall off on their own. By this time, it was around 3 o'clock in the morning, and no one had gotten any really good sleep. Again, they all headed to their bedrooms, and this time they were at least able to settle in and sleep a little bit without any further disturbances. On Sunday, November 24th, Jerry got up first and headed straight into the kitchen. There, he saw that the kitchen table was again flipped over, and now so were the kitchen chairs. The refrigerator had also moved, but this time it was blocking an exit door to the house. Before doing anything, he went into his bedroom and woke up Laura, telling her what he had found. As he's talking to Laura, a cheap plastic crucifix that hung on the wall fell and completely shattered. The material that this crucifix was made of would never have shattered that way, especially after it landed on carpet. It was in so many pieces, it was as if someone had put it in liquid nitrogen and then hit it with a hammer. A picture that said "Bless our home" with a picture of Jesus on it also fell. But it didn't just fall. It had literally been ripped from the wall along with the nails that held it up. And if that wasn't all, the television in their bedroom just toppled over all by itself. As they sat in their bedroom, wondering what just happened, they heard Marcia scream. They both bolted towards Marcia's room to see that her full chest of drawers had just fallen over, barely missing her as she laid in bed. Then came the sounds from the living room. All three of the reclining chairs in the living room were now moving on their own, as if they each had their own separate personality. Each chair would recline and then sit upright. Recline, then upright. Recline, then upright again, and again, and again. And so aggressively that the chairs would literally jump up off the floor. The television in the living room then began to make the sounds of a doorbell over and over again. Laura ran to the phone and called the Hoffmans. After screaming into the phone what was happening at the house, Harold was moving as fast as he could to get to the Goodins, while his wife stayed at home and called the police. As the Goodin family waited for Harold, they noticed Janet Holsworth, her dad John being the police officer, was outside walking, and they hollered at Janet for her to go get her dad because they were in trouble. John Holsworth, the officer, was the first one to arrive, and he found the family outside of the house completely terrified. He and Jerry then carefully walked into the house, and John couldn't believe what he was seeing. The house looked like a tornado had hit it. As John's taking in this devastation, the television in the living room started to move as if someone was pushing it from the side. After it seemed to settle where it was, John then walked over and looked all around it, searching for wires, anything that would have caused it to do what it just did. John then put the television back where it was supposed to be, and again, it began to turn on its own. At the same time, the recliners again began their activity, reclining then upright, reclining then upright. As John was in the house taking in all of this chaos, Harold showed up. Now, John by this time is on his police radio calling for backup. I don't know what he was hoping for when he called for backup. Maybe he just wanted to prove to himself that he wasn't crazy, and what he was seeing, he was really actually seeing. After John made the call, dispatch radioed the two officers who were on patrol that night, Carl Leonzi and Joe Tomek. They were told that there was an unknown issue over at 966 Lindley Street and to head straight over there to help John. They arrived shortly after getting the call, and Laura greeted them at the door. She took them into their bedroom and showed them what had happened there. The shattered crucifix on the floor, the picture that had been torn from the wall. Immediately, Officers Leonzi and Tomek believed that the house had been burgled. They assured Laura that her family was okay now. Whoever it was probably wasn't coming back. Laura then had to explain to them that it wasn't one person or even two people. This was happening all the time, and they could never see anything that was causing it. Officer Tomek walked over to the television in the Goodin's bedroom that had fallen over and put it back where it belonged. As soon as he did, the television lifted from its spot and just hung there in midair. He then investigated all around the television, swiping his hand under it, over it, behind it, looking for wires or anything that could be causing this and give him some kind of reasonable explanation. He found nothing. The television then began swinging like a pendulum in a grandfather clock. First slow and then faster and faster until it just abruptly stopped and the TV set itself back down. Just then, two additional officers arrived at the house, George Wilson and Leroy Lawson. Leonzi and Tomek updated them on what had happened. Now, even though Tomek had seen the television levitate and swing back and forth, he still couldn't bring himself to believe that what he saw was real. He still wondered if it was some kind of hoax. So where was Marcia during all of this, right? She ended up coming back inside when her mom and dad did, and as everyone else walked around, the officers and the family, Marcia settled in the living room and turned on cartoons. Marcia actually seemed to be completely unaffected by everything that was happening. Or at least if she wasn't letting on that it bothered her. The 5 officers, first John Holdsworth, then Leonze, Tomek, Wilson, and Lawson, along with their friend Harold Hoffman and the Goodins, all stood in the kitchen discussing what it could be and whether or not they should call the fire department. As they're having this conversation, another loud crash could be heard. This time it came from Marcia's room. Her dresser had fallen over again. As the group stood in the small hallway looking into Marcia's room, a cross that hung on the wall began to swing back and forth. The group looked at it, not knowing what to think. Just then, the cross flew off the wall and hit Officer Lawson. Within seconds, Officer Lawson was running out the front door. Police dispatch contacted the fire department, and Chief William Parks got the call. Officers were requesting assistance. Before long, Paul McKenna and fireman Jack Messina were also at the Goodin house. So the Goodins now had 4 officers, their friend Harold Hoffman, now Paul McKenna and Jack Messina from the fire department, along with the Goodins, all inside their small house. The firemen are brought up to speed on what had been happening. And as they're being told this information, fireman Jack Messina watched as the living room television just flipped over. At the time, no one was near it. Jerry then began to hear something and told everyone to be quiet. A rustling type sound could be heard coming from the living room. No one was sure what it was until Jerry pointed out the plastic roses that sat in a vase were moving around and around and around. These roses had come from Jerry Jr.'s grave. It wouldn't be the first time that they would notice these flowers moving on their own. Then came the smell. It started mild at first and grew stronger and stronger. It was strong, sharp, and horrible. It almost smelled like rotten eggs. It was the smell of sulfur. One of the firemen contacted the fire station. They didn't know what to do, and after explaining the situation to Chief Zwirline, he thought it might be best to ask for the help of the firehouse chaplain, Father Doyle. And that, my friends, is where we're going to end part 1. So based on what we've heard so far, and without hearing the rest of the story, which will be available next Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, I'd like to know what you think is going on. Why do you think that the Goodins, when they had all of this activity happening, which would be scary for anybody, why didn't they just up and leave the house? Why do you think that Marcia was so calm and didn't seem to be reacting to anything that was happening? Let me know in the comments. I'm very curious as to what you believe might be the issue. And next week, we will wrap it up with the rest of the story of 966 Lindley Street. Until then, take care, and we'll talk soon. Bye for now.